Welcome to RSM's Tax Summit Week 2021. Today's presentation is How Can Tax Technology Propel Your Business? Our presenters for today are Michael Charette and Heather Collins. At this time, I'm pleased to turn our call over to Heather Collins.
Thank you, everyone, for attending the presentation today. As was mentioned, I'm Heather Collins. I'm a Senior Director within our Business Tax Co-Sourcing Group. I'll give a quick introduction, let my colleague give a quick introduction of himself before we get on with the presentation. Mike?
My name is Mike Charette, and I'm a partner in the Tax Technology Consulting Group, and I lead the Canadian practice.
Okay. So we have an exciting agenda necessary for you today. We wanted to be able to really cover, hopefully some of you have attended our previous webcast that Mike and I did. We're now old pros at this point, but you know, we wanted to be able to cover some of the things that we didn't cover in our previous presentations relative to technology transformation and really looking at those next steps. So really the focus of the discussion today is going to be on change management overview, trying to be able to affect that within your overall tax and finance function, how you can necessarily plan for the change and what that necessarily looks like, and all the people, processes, and technologies you need to get together in order to do that. And finally, looking really at measuring the impact. So how can I determine really that I'm successful in doing the tax transformation? What does that look like? What do I need to produce as results to be able to report back to leadership that have approved this, or even that I need to look at internally within my own team to say, we were really successful on this, and maybe these are some of the things we need to change looking at going forward. So those were really the topics that we had to be able to cover in the session today. So hopefully you'll all enjoy. So at the end of this course, what we're expecting is that you will be able to understand the integration of people, process, and technology when you're going a tax transformation, and be able to look at how those need to come together when you're really trying to implement it. So, you know, kind of the planning, the decision-making is done. Now, when you're really trying to implement it, how do all those things be able to sing together? How can you make that work? Look at, you know, really what are the KPIs that you really need to have to be able to measure success? What are some of the things that Mike and I have typically seen within practice, within working with clients, and what does that look like? And what are those key points that would be great to measure? And, you know, looking at the change management area. So really at the outset, which is probably the first thing, that we're really going to cover, is looking at really the change management piece as you go into this next phase of doing the implementation and getting everyone on board to do that, and really figuring out what should your specific areas be that you look at relative to that exercise. So when we look at this tax transformation journey, and I always think it's funny when I look at this, you kind of look at a squiggly line and be like, does it really work like that? And I would say, I don't think anything works in a straight line anymore. I think it really kind of ebbs and flows, just how your processes do, your people and data do, and how that changes, you know, throughout the course of what you're doing. And so I think that this is a good depiction of that, to be able to say, here's kind of what it looks like. You have things that you're working towards, you kind of have that uptick, then you have things that you're evaluating, and you kind of keep flowing as the changing environment does. So what we have covered before in previous presentations is we really kind of focused on the value proposition. Why would you necessarily do a tax transformational change? What is really the benefit that you have as an overall finance or tax function in doing that? And so those were kind of the key ones that we covered in previous sessions that I hope that some of you attended. And then what we're really focusing on today when we get into the implementation stage is really aligning all the resources in order to be able to execute, and really the measuring the impact of that journey. So, you know, part of the processes, because we want to get you all up to speed of the people that didn't attend the previous presentations of what is driving necessarily the need to change. I think everyone can realize in the environment that we're in, whether it's relative to COVID or even just with tax reform, there have been a lot of drivers in the past couple of years that are really forcing that need to change. And I think as we see the labor market changing and having resources hard to be able to come by, and definitely in some instances, I think that has, driven the focus on tax transformation, trying to be able to automate things and be able to make things work better so that way people can be spending time on value-added activities versus, time on data entry. So I look at when I started out in the tax practice, gone are the days where you're kind of ticking and tying things in workbooks and you have like a 50-page workbook folder that you're looking through on all the work papers and everything and putting all the tick marks to be able to tie it out. Now people are wanting to be able to see that, be automated. And, people are expecting it, even, people coming out of college are looking for those technology advances. So not only are we seeing, of course, from an accounting firm arena, I think companies are seeing it as well as they onboard new talent into their organizations on seeing the need that people are wanting to be able to have those technology enablers relative to that. And I think from a company perspective, that also helps with the market trends on how you can differentiate yourself in the marketplace. People like to be able to work for companies that, are driving tax transformation value, having people focus on value-added activities. And so I think as we, go away from kind of that manual data entry and things that we're used to, even to some extent, some Excel spreadsheets, although it's difficult for me to imagine that all going away, working in Excel. I think then, people are shifting to be able to plan for what's next, because I think we're seeing really in the market that that's changing and evolving. Who knows? We're expecting kind of some tax reform potentially by year end. So with all of that coming to fruition, it's really driving that and driving the change within businesses. And even as we've seen a lot of businesses, go for a lot more IPOs in the past year or so, carving out some of their business in order to be able to do that. That even is a function in of itself on driving a change to standing up a whole tax department if you necessarily need to as you go under that transition, or just being acquisitive in general that we've definitely seen in the private equity marketplace, having different entities come in and come out of your organization, being able to adapt to that. So in order to be able to do that, you need to be able to have an automated process across your tax function to be able to take those changes and be able to take it well, and not have people burden on, if we acquire this new company or something, it's going to take me months to be able to get our work papers and what, my team does up to speed and be able to incorporate that into our existing organization. That is really what is affecting a lot of this change in the marketplace. And that were some of the pieces that we covered in previous, presentations to kind of sell at home, but now I just summed it up in 10 minutes, on why we're seeing really that need for change. I know Mike's laughing because he's seen it. We've lived it, right, Mike?
Yeah.
In the past couple of years. We've definitely lived it in trying to be able to force that and look at that. But I guess, Mike, was there anything that you've seen, to be able to add to this on other areas of focus on what's driving it? Is there anything that I missed?
I think just in form of the agility, just in the context of COVID, it's just other than just regular business activities, but the way that COVID is really impacting the way that we do work. So it's not even necessarily a business driver, but just the need to do things differently to accommodate the fact that we might be working from home, or we might be have hybrid, or we might be talent starved and we're going to have to start recruiting remotely. And so it's not even just our core business and tax processes that we need to change, but we have to actually just rethink how we're going to interact with the team in general. And so we're seeing different types of drivers that we may not have seen 5 or 6 years ago.
No, absolutely. I think that's been a lot of the change management, and we talk about change management that we're going to talk about in a little bit. That's been, definitely the change management process that people have undergone in the past 2 years is really adapting to the workforce change and, how we necessarily work change. So, see, I did a very good precursor to a lead-in to Mike talking about the change management topic. So I'll hand it over to Mike.
So let's put this in context of where we are in this journey. So we have, we know that we need to change. We've gone and made the business case to make the change. We've told that story, and our leadership has accepted the idea and said, okay, we accept your business case. Now go and make this transformation. But what the business case doesn't necessarily cover is all of the little nitty-gritty things that actually have to happen to execute. And it's more than just a project plan. You have to understand what's happening within your organization, how this project affects your organization, how it affects the people, what people will be involved, what stakeholders will be involved. And so there's a lot of thinking that has to happen that maybe was done at a high level during the business case, but someone has likely not sat down and gone through each of these items in total. And so change management is the first planning step. So planning how we're going to change before we actually execute the change to make sure that we achieve better results. So what is change? So change management, or organizational change management, is the approach to transitioning an organization from its current state to the new state. And the goals of that is to deliver the business case benefit. So, the reason leadership has allowed us to go and make this change, to accelerate the results, to align with the organizational practices and the organizational values, and to improve the speed of adoption. And that's really a key point, in that the people who are likely asking for the change and driving the change, and the leadership accepting that change, are not necessarily the people who are now responsible for executing. There will be some overlap, but we now actually have to transition to a whole new group of people, and we need to set the context for them. We need to make them understand why we're doing this, how this aligns, what's in it for them, what's in it for their function, and also for making sure that all of those individuals who need to support the change and support the future state understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And we have to map out everything involved with those people. So we need to manage all of our tools, we need to prepare all the rules, and we need to engage all the schools, all the people in our organization, and put a plan together, our project plan together, that incorporates all of these different stakeholder needs. And so, and as we mentioned, is like there are resources and technology and a lot of other things, but the key item with change is really around people and understanding the different types of people who are going to be involved in your process. And they are going to present the most common problems, and we want to identify those people and the potential problems up front. So some of the things that we see, is just general resistance to change. I've been doing this for 10 or 15 years, and I like it. It works fine. Why are you making me change? So the internal politics. So, there's all kinds of internal politics. I don't think we need to rehash it, but there's a lot of reasons why a program might conflict with another program, and how are we going to navigate that? There could be existing team dysfunction. Not all the time do all of our teammates agree with each other and are rowing in the same direction. And it's very hard to execute a project when that's happening. So how are we going to manage that situation? Coaching all the stakeholders. So oftentimes there are many people involved with executing the change and executing the future state who had nothing, had no part in deciding, that the change was happening or the future state. So how do we coach these people to want to adopt this change? How do we coach them to have the necessary skills to enact the necessary behaviors to execute? Managing ambiguity and uncertainty. So I think the thing with most transformation projects is we understand what the business value is going to be, and we have a very good idea of what we want the destination to be, but there's a lot of ambiguity. As we have that curly path for a reason. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs. It's not going to be a straight line. And for some people, that ambiguity and uncertainty is very challenging for them on a day-to-day basis. So how are we going to manage that uncertainty? How are we going to communicate to everybody to make sure that they, even though there is uncertainty, that uncertainty is being managed well. And then the last thing is change fatigue. I think COVID has really highlighted this a lot. There are so many things happening, so many things changing, not just within an organization, but in people's personal lives, that there might just not be the appetite. So when we're thinking about the timing of a change, yes, we have the business case. Yes, we know we need to do this, but maybe we need to take a little breather because everybody's just gone through so much lately. So maybe this isn't a Q3 item. Maybe it's a Q1 item. And we want to talk about, and we have to understand who these stakeholders are and what their impact is. Everybody's important to the solution, but we also have to be mindful of the fact that there are people with various levels of power and various levels of concern, and understanding those people's power and concern. And that power doesn't necessarily mean explicit power in the form of leadership, but it could be implied power in the form of they're a key resource, and making sure that we understand what their concerns are and addressing those concerns. Additionally, we want to know who our advocates are and making sure that they're advocating for us correctly. And so executing the change really comes down to doing three key steps. So the first is we have that business case, we know what our objectives are, and we have a general idea. Usually when we're talking about transformation, some technology is at the center of this, but we need to do a further discovery to understand all of the context that's happening within the organization. What were previous projects like? What were the lessons learned in that project about the project itself or about the organization? Can we assess the landscape for change? Really important is if we're implementing a piece of technology and IT has to support that, what other things do they have going on? Do they have the time to support this? When do they have the time to support this? Understanding who's accountable. So we know that inevitably some leader is accountable, but for the underlying specific components, and then validating, the financial and non-financial drivers. Like how are we, what are those items? We probably have things around ROI and payback period outlined in the plan, but there are going to be other drivers that are identified as we gather those detailed requirements and that detailed understanding of our organization to allow us to put together that plan for execution. And then once we have an overall plan, once we understand the landscape, we now need to create, a plan and get alignment with that plan. So we want our leadership to assess the plan, ensure that they feel that it's effective. We need to communicate the plan to all of the individuals. We need to get buy-in from them. We want to have advocates for the process. But essentially, we need everybody rowing in the right direction before we can begin executing. And then when we get to the change implementation, this is where we start to execute. So we've now gathered all of our detailed requirements. We understand what value we're trying to deliver. We understand how this fits into our organization. We understand how this fits into the strategy. And we have a detailed plan on how we want to execute, and now we can execute. So then planning for change. So let's take it to another more granular level is, well, what's going into that plan? What are the things that we should be thinking about? And so we have this pyramid that outlines different layers of things that we want to be considering. So our first layer, our top layer, is the strategy. So why are we, we have to remember the context here is that the strategy, why we want to change, was already decided at the leadership level. They've already accepted the case for change. But now we have to take that strategy and we need to make sure that all of the components of our project actually line up with that strategy. So when we're taking a look at our planning, we need to make sure that, as a really easy, for instance, there might be, a strategy to insource everything. So we no longer want to use third-party providers for our tax compliance, as a for instance. And so as we're thinking that through and we're talking with our various vendors and our various stakeholders, we have to make sure that that piece of the strategy is accounted for. So if there's a component of the process or the technology that actually has to be outsourced and that doesn't align with the strategy, then we have to come up with a solution to make it align with the strategy. So understanding the strategy and communicating it to the people executing is really critical to make sure that we deliver that business value that is expected by leadership. Data is the new frontier. I think data has always been important, but for most transformation projects, it's actually central to it. And data becomes, really critical in the context of, especially in tax and finance transformation, in that this is the most critical business and in some cases our client information. And so we need tax to take ownership of tax information. And now we have to start thinking as part of our plan, well, how do we execute everything around data? And how is data going to be stored, or how is data going to interact with our future processes? And then coming down to our processes, or our third layer, is how do you execute the actual deliverable? So there's some technology, there's some transformation, there's a reason why we're doing this project, and it's usually centered around a piece of software. So maybe we're purchasing a provision software or a compliance software, or we're implementing an expense system or an invoicing system, a close system. We don't know. I don't know. And there's so many different types of projects we can be doing, but that system itself is only one component of the process. So there are many steps leading up to using that particular tool, and then after we use that tool, there are many steps afterwards in the forms of controls and review and analysis. So we want to make sure that we map out our entire process to accommodate our strategy in general, our data, and this new piece of technology that we're likely going to implement, and maybe potentially understanding additional technologies that are needed. And then from a technology point of view, what technology is going to be part of the process. So we've outlined all of the steps to executing, and we know that there's some, major piece of software that's likely being involved, but what are all the supplementary tools that are needed to execute this process? Are there systems integrations that we have to do? Are there security integrations that we have to do? Are there things that we're currently doing manual that our tool is not going to address, but we could potentially automate it another way? So we want to think through all of that. And then on the side, we have people, because people are involved in all of these layers. So it's incorrect to say people are their own layer. People are just part of every single one of these things. And we always need to consider people, because people are executing, people are creating risk or mitigating risk, people are reviewing, and they're making decisions all up and down all of our layers. So we want to make sure that we understand those people needs as we move forward. So getting into the nitty-gritty again, so again, from a strategy point of view is, making sure that we're communicating back out why we're doing this project to the people that didn't necessarily have a say in the project initially. They might have provided some feedback. So we need to re-communicate that story that we told to leadership, right? That, to create that sense of urgency, to create the importance, to achieve that buy-in. And, communicating that story, the why, creates a powerful identity for the project and for the stakeholders. And we want them to, to have ownership over this. We want them to identify with this. We want them to want to achieve this goal for change as much as leadership wants the change to be executed. And then when? So like the strategy is right away, right? So as soon as we have the mandate, right, the strategy is the first layer. It's the first thing that we want to communicate, the first element to alignment, right? How this is going to impact the business, how this is going to impact the organization, how this is going to impact the team, right? So we need to, that's what the strategy is dictating, and we need to inform our team right away. So considerations around the data side, the high-level thing about this is really about ownership. So historically, tax wasn't information owners. They were information producers. We would go and to finance and operations and this system and that system, and we would take all of that stuff and do some things and manipulations with it, pop it into a tax return or some other calculator that we're working with, and we would create tax information, we would file it, put it in a folder, and stuff it away. There was really no ownership of the information. It was everybody else's information. And the difference now is with tax tools and tax systems in general is that tax is actually the owner of a lot of really key, important business information. And so when we're putting together these strategies, we have to look at it from the context of an owner. We can no longer say, oh, that's IT's problem or that's the business problem. We're just going to use this. So we need to start thinking around the data security and privacy. And then we have to stay up to date on, well, what are the external rules? What are the internal rules? What controls are we required to have for our information? It's really key that everybody in the organization who own pieces of information are very diligent about security and privacy. Data storage is really becoming an important thing. We think in business intelligence and finance transformation about creating the one source of the truth. So we have to think about the same thing when we're doing tax transformation. What is that one source of the truth? Where is that one source of the truth going to live? And in what software? Are we going to have our own repository, or is the software itself going to be the repository, or are we going to have files stored away in a document management system? And then data governance, again, understanding, how long we're going to hold on to data, who has access to that data, who needs that data, who needs that information, right? We want to make sure that we have the right governance around all of this information that we're now the owner of, and then the support. So while we are the owner of the information, we are unlikely to be able to solve our own problems. So we want to make sure that we have the right support in place such that when there's a disruption to our business or a disruption to our systems, that we know how is that going to be recovered. What is the business continuity plan around our data infrastructure? And then process considerations. So again, we've outlined that we have an existing process. We have a strategy to change that process, but are we really changing everything, or are we implementing a small portion of it? And that change has so many different impacts, which we can't really cover all today, and it really depends on the nature of the project. But when we're going to go through the effort of changing and identifying our processes, so we want to take a look at the whole thing from the start to the finish, not just the thing that we're trying to implement. So again, we want to start right at our first principles, think about all of the steps that need to be executed until we get to our new piece of technology or our new tool, and then all of the steps that are happening afterwards, and thinking through, are we doing everything the right way to maximize the benefit of this new tool that's in place? And can we scale? So are there certain limitations either before or after this new piece of tool that actually limits our ability to grow and scale the use and realize all of the benefit? The other thing we want to think about is the seasonality. And seasonality plays into two components. One is that, we might only do a certain activity once a year or once a quarter. And if we create vague and uncertain processes, or, hey, just do what happened last year, people forget, people turn over, new people are coming in. So we have to really understand, well, how do we create really good standard operating procedures such that someone who hasn't executed a particular tax function in a year can pick up that procedure and break it down and understand it and follow it, so that all of the controls and other items that we built into it are followed properly. But most importantly, that they just execute it effectively. The other thing we want to do is we don't want to make something too cumbersome, right? We're only doing this once a year, so there might not be economic benefit to overdoing it. So we want to think through kind of the pros and cons of certain decisions when we're thinking about seasonality. And then governance is always important across every single process. So how are we going to manage every single activity? How do we know who's doing what activity? How do we make sure that the quality control is there? How are we ensuring that the process is delivering delivering the solution or the deliverable or the benefit that was planned to. So we build all of our controls and governance into our process. And then the ongoing measurement part is we know that the first time we do something, even the second or third time we do something, it's probably not going to be perfect. So how are we going to track our activities? How are we going to measure effectiveness? Not in the, in the KPI of ROI and so forth, but like, how do we understand, what things did we build or what things did we change? Are they actually good or are they bad? And some of that is somewhat subjective. So someone might just say, hey, this process is taking me a long time to execute and I don't really like doing it. That could just be someone who doesn't want to change, but they could have a valid opinion about, what, maybe we've just made this particular piece cumbersome. So how are we going to track those issues? How are we going to be agile and change those issues? So we need to think through, the idea of continuous improvement. How are we going to enable continuous improvement into our current and future state? And then finally, to technology considerations. So again, normally tax transformation is centered around some form of technology, but it's only one piece of the puzzle, right? So we think if I'm implementing a tax revision software or a tax compliance software, I'm usually drawing information from other systems. So I need to think through, like, well, do I want to automate the integration of those systems? Do I want to automate the integration of security and have single sign-on? Are there elements of my process that are not being handled by the software itself that I want to automate, and what tools do I want to automate? And so if we're going to make those decisions around using IT resources for security and integration, if we're going to use third parties for automating certain functions, or we're going to carve out staff time to do that automation themselves, we have to go all the way back to the beginning and think about, does this fit our strategy? Are these issues scalable? What is the economic value? Are we getting payback? Is there ROI? And how are users going to interact and interface with these tools? How does this fit into the process? So all of those things we thought about when we were buying the initial piece of technology, when we're introducing other technologies to augment our existing process, we also have to have those same considerations. And there's lots of things. So choosing the right solution to support your vision. So there's so many different pieces of technology that can support our implementations. And so we look at this is our ecosystem of potential tools that can be used for tax transformation. And normally our starting point is some form of, large tax tool or a system change. Maybe we're implementing a new ERP or a data mart or something along that line. But then there's all of these supplementary pieces of technology that we can use to make our process better. And again, we need to think through, well, what is the right size, right fit for what we're doing, right? Like, I love RPA, but is RPA the right answer for something, or I should define our robotic process automation. So I love robotic process automation, but is it the right thing to spend a lot of money building a bot for something that we might do once a year and there's not a high volume? Yes, it will execute more efficiently these low cognitive data entry tasks than a human would be, but how much time does it take to implement and develop it? So as we're thinking about these supplementary technologies and processes, we need to consider, is it the right fit for what we're doing? And I'm going to kick it back to Heather to talk about how the people are, our people are involved in all of these layers of our pyramid.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Yeah, if you go back, I know you love your your pyramid diagram, and so as Mike indicated earlier, people go across all the aspects of what Mike just talked about with strategy, data, process, and technology. And so when everyone looks at when you need to look at the people aspect, really the focus is on, do I have the right people in order to do this? So hopefully when you went and submitted the business case, you probably had a budget relative to the external resources that you might be bringing on board to be able to help you do the implementations of, particular software or something like that. So hopefully you've kind of got that out of the way. But then it really is also looking at the internal side on saying, do I have the right people within my finance and tax function to be able to execute this? And so usually how I look at this, even an example of something that I worked with a client on recently, when you do have something, I'll go back to tax provision implementation example, is that usually you have a champion that you're expecting once you kind of indicate, this is the first thing that I want to do, is implement a tax provision software. Usually you have a champion that is going to stand behind it. One, that they're willing to be able to do it. They have an interest in doing it, and they were working with you really on the business case to be able to push it through. So hopefully you've identified that champion already during the business case exercise, because that would be key. If you didn't, you definitely need to do that quickly. So really those yay-sayers versus the naysayers, identifying a few key people in the process is going to be crucial in order to be able to get things implemented, and then making sure that they have the support that they need, because maybe, like I said, if I go back to the tax provision software example, is that if a client, that we have that we're working on a provision implementation, they identify their champion, but, they're aware of their champion actually doesn't know that software. So that's where they've identified, well, they need support in order to be able to execute it. They're going to need training in order to be able to get that stood up. So when you have, some of those high-level business cases that maybe haven't went into the details, find out who your key implementer is going to be, who your key champion is going to be, and then identify based upon their skill set what support that they need. So if you didn't get assistance for them, that you can get it very quickly to be able to get the training and everything to get them up to speed on the product. Because you don't want to have them necessarily feeling left, that they're holding it and having to figure out everything on their own. Sometimes there are definitely people that really like to do that, but at least having, some experience in working with, necessarily potentially an outside firm could be helpful, so that way they can have someone to go to when they have questions. And it could even be the software vendor. That's a lot of times what they're necessarily there for, is to be able to help out with those things. So, understanding if you have the right people, and I say at least identify a champion for each of the aspects that you're going to change. I mentioned the software implementation is one, but it could be something relative to, whether you're using RPA, robotic process automation that Mike mentioned before. That's not for every organization, but if you are, again, having the champion, but then having the support behind it, whether it's through the software vendor, whether it's through an external accounting firm, or, is necessarily needed to be able to do that. And then finally, I guess not finally, because I have a few other points, but I guess the other piece is IT usually is an effective support. As you put that detailed implementation plan together, there's probably going to be some aspect, if you're implementing, some sort of software or new product, that they're going to need to be able to support that as well. So making sure as you put that detailed project plan together, identify the additional resources, there definitely can be an IT element to that too, and support that they're necessarily going to give. And I know that any time that, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was going to say, just to add on to that, is IT has people too, and it might affect your timeline if you want to implement during a specific window, and they say, oh, we're doing 6 other projects at the same time. So, that support feature might be limited as well, and it's something to really to consider, that, my timeline might be affected by the fact that there aren't people in IT to actually do the thing I want them to do at the time I need them to do it.
And I think one of the other things which sometimes people miss, especially with onboarding, again, I always go back to onboarding like a new software system, is the fact, how is it going to be maintained and what does that process look like? So if you're implementing a system, where it might just be 3 people to use, maybe that's not that big of a deal. If you're implementing a broader system where there's going to be multiple people within your organization that are going to use it, you definitely need a support system around that. So how are tickets when issues come up? How is that going to go? Who's going to answer them? What's level 1 support? What's level 2 support? What's level 3 support? Who are experts? And so, it really depends upon the scale of what you're trying to implement to understand even how much support that you need. But, outlining that support process on who it goes to just to be able to get people set up in the system, access to setting up a client side or a site or whatever it might be, depending upon, again, what you're implementing, as well as who is going to be the experts or the SMEs to be able to go to outside of just the general, we need to add a person, we need to remove a person, we need to set this up, we need to deactivate it. Who's the people that are going to be the go-to people within your organization to answer the questions, to answer those detailed questions, who really know the ins and outs of the product. And so that, I would say that is something that definitely needs to be developed internally. You could only involve consultants for so long, necessary for that process. So, having that thought of necessary within your timeline in the implementation is key, because I would say that sometimes people just focus on the implementation of it and don't focus on the maintenance that's going to occur afterwards, or the support that's going to need to be done afterwards, to even get the feedback. So even getting feedback of, well, we would want this enhanced. This doesn't make sense. This is not that automated. It's really not working the way that we would want. Kind of those channels to be able to do that. I kind of wrap that all into support. And there's going to be people that need to be able to do that, and there's going to need to be it goes back to the process technology side. There might be a process and technology side to that as well. But there is definitely going to be people that are going to have to be assigned within your organization to be able to help execute as it relates to that. So measuring impact. I mean, this is always what I look at as the biggest thing, because when I've worked with clients or even internally myself on trying to be able to drive transformation and change, initially you always kind of measure it, hopefully, when you're putting the business case together. Maybe not always. Maybe you're always just to be able to say, we have this budget, we think that it's going to be helpful, can we get it approved, and it just gets approved. But a number of times you're asked to be able to put in those business cases what the return on investment is going to be. So then you're going to have to be able to indicate, as it gets implemented and as it's being used, how are you going to measure that? So there are a multitude of ways to be able to look at it. And so I mentioned the business case and the return on investment being one. So there was definitely something that you had to do at the beginning to be able to say, well, I think this is going to save, this amount of hours relative to our process, or people can focus on something else. Or I think this is going to save, X amount potentially of outside consulting dollars that we necessarily spend that we need to be able to do. Now you're going to have to prove that out and say, did it meet that? And that's where I think that you definitely need to set the tone on when those metrics are going to be able to be measured. And what I mean by that is, of course you have the implementation and when the process improvements and technology are going to be launched, and you have, you need to have a date or dates associated with that. And then there should be a point, after it, that you evaluate to say, okay, so now at X point, 6 months post, or after we finish, the Q1 provision, or after we finish the tax returns, or after we finish, X process, then we can look at and measure it and say, yes, we saved this amount of time. So what I've seen sometimes people do, because it can even get in the level of details on the people and the time side, if it's going to be measured based upon the amount of time saving, is they even set up different codes within their organization, so that way they can easily track that. And that way they can really report on that afterwards to say, yes, if we look at, here's what we spent initially, and hopefully you have, you need to start with a starting point of the foundation. Here's what we spent initially. Based upon the time that now was charged to the code in these different areas, now we spent X. So I can easily account for that differential to be able to say that we saved time in order to do that. Of course, if it's a budgeting piece that you save money with using outside consultants and those types of things, that's probably easier to be able to quantify. But like I said, sometimes people have went into the time and charge codes on how each employee necessarily charges time, and creates, specific predefined codes relative to it in order to do that. And what you would want to make sure if you go through that particular exercise is the fact that you base it upon actually when they're live and they're using it versus the implementation setup. Because you don't want to get any one-time cost, one-time investment in that, because that's not going to be over year process. And that's really not going to be, make sense to be able to evaluate what your efficiency and what your gain necessarily has been, because definitely there's going to be one-time costs that are going to be incurred that you're not going to get back, but hopefully year over year you can see how that would be absorbed based upon the other savings that you do. So sometimes it gets into those details. I would say the other piece that I've seen measured outside of, determining did I really get my return on investment that I set out with initially is really looking at, did this work well? So maybe I had time savings, maybe, we saved money on not using outside consultants, but are there things that we did well and things that we need to improve upon, and how do we look at that? And how do we measure that, and how is that quantified? A little bit it can go back to the support area that I mentioned before, is that maybe that's part of your support process is also tracking enhancements, but there needs to be something to be able to look at that so that way you can really evaluate how this has been successful as well as evaluate what you need to adjust. Because I think everyone can realize that going through whatever you necessarily do the first time, even when it's live, and even if you've done testing and did, POCs or pilot testing in a live setting, it's different. It's always going to be different. You try and make it that you did it as close as possible when you did your POC or pilot, but it's definitely different. And so you need to adjust going forward because you're like, this didn't work as well as I did that I thought it would in the live setting. I think we really need to focus on, maybe changing the process flow and how this is working, maybe bringing other automations, that we did before. So maybe we did a tax provision implementation, but you know what, that data going into there didn't work. So I need to look at Alteryx or a data transformation tool in order to look at that. So there might be different things that you realize going through that live scenario that you really need to be able to adjust and assess. And that really should be a recurring process that happens, through every iteration that you're running through that process and technology. That should be done, reoccurring, necessarily each time. And if you're able to be able to do that while the project is going on, that's great. But usually a lot of times you have kind of that post analysis where you're like, okay, well, this could have went better if we did this. So let's adjust and maybe make sure that we implement that the next time. Oops, I skipped. I went too far ahead, and they were getting closer to being up on time. But these are some of the typical, KPIs that we necessarily see. I mentioned it already. The first two, those are the first two that always go in my head, is about external fees and organizational efficiency. But, I think that the other ones, which are some of the stuff that we talked about in the beginning on what's driving change and having people work on more value-added activities, is really kind of the lowering turnover. So that's where some of those things come into place. People potentially don't want to work the 60 and 70 hours a week that I was used to, definitely coming up in public accounting. People don't necessarily want to do that. They want to have more work-life balance. So being able to reduce that over time, lower the turnover, those are all the things that we expect to be able to see or hope that we necessarily get, after we do those tax transformations. So looking at that and looking at people's schedules, seeing that your employees are happier, seeing it's like, my turnover ratio was now 50, now it's down to 25%. Looking at those certain aspects, I think are helpful in addition to the fees and the time savings, because then that's other things that, you definitely can easily measure, by working with HR and those types of things on giving you those reports. But, that you're able to easily measure as you go through this. So I guess I'll leave you with that, I think everyone realizes that change is not the easiest. And sometimes I know that even I still myself probably pull out that calculator and pull out my notes to be able to say, what do those journal entries look like? Definitely from time to time. But I think that what we've seen as an evolving industry with accounting and within tax is that we see the benefits from it once we implement it. And so that's where it's key to be able to cover the things that we talked about today relative to change management and really focusing on the people aspect of it, because people are going to make it successful or people are going to make it fail. The technology already is set. Technology does what you thought it was going to do because that's what you did when you put the business case together, is you evaluated technology. So really the effect of what's really going to make it successful or not successful is people. And so I think that's really the major focus point. I guess, Mike, do you have anything else before we close to add?
I think there's, you can template, certain activities that you want to do, but it is going to be different every time. And I think from, what I'm learning throughout the pandemic is that there is, an idea that people want to work with organizations that are enacting best practices. I as an individual go through my career wanting to learn what is the best. I don't want to feel like I'm falling behind my colleagues or my peers. And, it's important that, that organizations move with the times to attract the best talent, and to keep their people happy and engaged. And I think that's just kind of one of those key takeaways from this, is that the change really is about the people, and there's so many angles to the people. There's so many angles from that people point of view.
Okay. So I think with that, we'll turn it back to Allison to close us out.
Okay, we apologize for the technical difficulties we were experiencing there just then. Seems as our system had a mind of its own and was running rampant with the polling questions there. So everybody don't panic. We're going to get ready and do the polling questions here in just a moment. You haven't missed any polling questions yet. You still have the opportunity to get your CPE credit. In the meantime, we do invite you to join us for submitting the questions. Just a moment, please. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties all over today. Again, apologies. We invite you now to submit your questions using the Q&A panel on the screen. You can do so at any time between now and the end of today's webcast. We do have 5 polling questions ready for you now. You can go ahead and begin right now. Heather, take it away.
Okay, so everyone don't panic. You're going to get your CPE. So first question, when you experience barriers to adoption, what is the main cause? Please select your response and hit submit. So either A, stakeholder resistance to change, B, lack of communication, C, lack of leadership modeling of behaviors supportive change, D, change fatigue, E, lack of governance. Again, please submit your answer to experiencing barriers to adoption. What is the main cause? I'll move on to the next one. Okay, let's get all those submitted. 77%. I know we might have some people drop off. I've dropped off already. Trying to see if I can get to 80 before I move on. Okay, let's just move on. So most people indicated stakeholder resistance to change. That definitely is a big one that we've seen a lot in the marketplace. Okay, number 2. Do you have a change management plan as part of your transformation project? A, yes. B, no. C, don't know, but we manage change informally on our projects. This should be a quick one to be able to get everyone to answer. Yes, no, or don't know. Change management plan. Okay, I think we're back to 79% of attendees. I'll let it go for another moment. Hopefully people are getting the polling questions. I still see some people saying that they're not.
And for those that are having difficulty, go ahead and refresh your browser. We will come back. We'll give you a chance to have one extra polling question before the end here. But go ahead and refresh your browser if you're not seeing the polling question in the slide window on your screen.
Okay, now we got better attendance right now with 87% of attendees. So I'll move on. Okay, so most people indicated that, yes, they have a change management plan, which is very important. 3, how do you share the case for a change in your organization? A, it's part of an overall transformation strategy. B, a piece of collateral, share with stakeholders and sponsors. C, through communications. D, all of the above. E, we don't share the case for change. Hopefully it's not E. Hope to see what people submit. I'll let it give it another moment. We're getting 80%, which is pretty good. Let's see if we can get a few more. We're at the 83%. 86. Okay, with 2 minutes to go, I'll move forward. So 56% all of the above. So that's great that there's always a multitude of ways to be able to share this case for change. So glad we didn't see a lot of E. There's a little 5% one there. Okay, 4, how effective is your change management measurement approach? A, very effective. We can easily track, monitor, and use our progress to share success stories. B, effective. We can track and monitor our progress. C, neutral. We measure but cannot easily show progress. D, not effective. Adoption metrics are difficult to develop and track. This has always been a difficult one relative to teams, is just measuring it within your function. Okay, we're at the 81%. Go for another mix. I know we have another one left. Another few seconds so everyone can submit. Okay, we'll move to the last one. A minute left. We've got 91% there. So B and C, effective and neutral. So we got some in between there. Okay, the last one. Would you like to talk more about this topic with an RSM professional? A, yes. B, no. Try and keep it simple. Everyone is trying to leave, so hopefully people get this one submitted before then. This is the top of the hour. And did you say that we were going to do another one before I close it out?
We'll go back and we'll give them a freebie. We'll go back to number 1 and let people have a chance to answer that one again.
Okay. Okay, so let's give the people that couldn't, for those of you that stayed on, to answer one again, just to make sure that you got it in. So when
I think that'll do it, Heather.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for attending today.
Thank you so much to Heather Collins and to Michael Charette as well. And a couple of reminders to our audience before we conclude. Please take a moment to visit the resources list to the right of your screen. As you see, we have a number of valuable resources that we've made available to you today during today's presentation. You can also click the link to go directly back to the Tax Summit lobby or to the networking lounge where you can chat with the presenters from today's session following this event. If you have met CPE criteria, you may download a copy of your certificate by visiting the Certification Center and clicking the download icon. Be sure to save a copy to your computer in the next few minutes before we conclude our event. Smartphone users can download their certificate from any computer at a later date using today's webcast link. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to you participating in the remainder of RSM's Tax Summit Week 2021. Have a great day.